Sandy, let's come back to you then, and gun control, because the issue of farmers' access, the right to use shotguns, is something which is coming under increasing pressure once again.
Yes, I had a big chat with a few farmers down in Devon recently, and they had a few very major concerns about all of this. Firstly, just to put you in the picture, the government funding for the Farming Resilience Fund has been cut. It's a fund that supported mental health charities in the agricultural sector. With the inheritance tax changes in the Labour budget, many older farmers are now in a position where if they die, it's awful, really. If they die before April 2026, then whoever they pass their farm on to won't have the estate valued under the new inheritance tax rules. And frankly, I mean, this is a very dark thought, but it's putting pressure almost to older farmers to possibly contemplate taking their own lives before April 2026, which is absolutely horrible. They for fear of they've built up their farms over decades, sometimes centuries, and they've got the notion of it being portioned off and sold to survive, potentially becoming unviable in that process. So we have to look at the old Hegelian dialect coming into play: problem, reaction, solution. This is where we get onto the current gun laws and restrictions being imposed on farmers, because the scrutiny on their mental health could deter farmers from seeking mental health support for fear of losing their firearms as well. The UK has some of the strictest gun laws in the world, and these laws have obviously evolved incrementally over time, and significantly impacting British farmers at the same time. They rely on their firearms, primarily shotguns and rifles, for pest control and livestock management. But successive firearm restrictions have made it increasingly difficult for them to own and use guns for legitimate agricultural purposes. Really from 1920, when the Firearms Act came in, and then 1968, it was amended, and tighter controls on gun licensing. With firearm certificates for rifles and pistols, and shotgun certificates for smoothbore shotguns. This act introduced the good reason requirement for owning a firearm, which meant farmers had to justify why they needed one. However, pest control and agricultural use were still valid reasons then. And then in 1988, we had the Firearms Amendment because of the Hungerford massacre, when 16 people sadly were shot by a legally owned firearm. And new restrictions were introduced, and they banned semi-automatic rifles and pump-action rifles over 2.22 calibers. So farmers could no longer use semi-automatic rifles for pest control, making rabbit and fox control more difficult. Then in 1997, we had the Dunblane massacre, where handguns were almost entirely banned in the UK. And farmers who previously used handguns for humane animal dispatch had to switch to captive bolt guns or single shot pistols, which require special licensing anyway. And this made humane dispatch more bureaucratic and difficult in emergency situations. So again, in 2016, more amendments imposed because of the post-terror attacks in Europe. And then in 2020 and to 2023, tighter shotgun licensing and police discretion was imposed because of the Plymouth shooting in 2021. So all of this has just been incremental. It's just kind of like made it more and more difficult. So farmers now face stricter scrutiny with greater emphasis on mental health checks, and the tightening of UK gun laws has generally followed major criminal incidents or public outcry. And some police forces have been arbitrarily revoking shotgun licence, even for minor concerns, making it hard for farmers to retain their firearms. The latest tightening of shotgun laws is making it harder for farmers to access and retain shotguns, which could have serious consequences for agriculture. There's an increased bureaucracy and cost for them, more paperwork, medical assessments. Police oversight means that general costs for farmers, or when they're already under financial pressure. you've got lambing. Sometimes they need the shotguns for protecting the lambs during lambing from foxes and other predators. So it's difficult. The current trends are that farmers could face severe difficulties in obtaining or keeping shotguns, which are essential tools in rural life. And there's a growing concern that bureaucratic overreach and arbitrary revocations could harm both individual farmers and the broader agricultural industry. The rural firearms sector is being very, very divided on this, and it's quite clever the way they've done it. The one farmer described it to me as first they came for the semi-automatic rifles, but the clay pigeon shooters said, I don't shoot clay pigeons, I only shoot clay pigeons and with a shotgun, so I'm not going to worry about it. And then they came for the handguns, but the deer hunters use bolt-action rifles, so they weren't worried. And then they came for the bolt-action rifles, but the game shooters shoot game birds with shotguns, so they weren't worried. And now they're coming for the shotguns, so they're going to have nothing and no one to fight this as they're all divided. To be honest, the UK, had a society in which widespread licensed gun ownership was the norm. There's no provable link between the further tightening of gun rules and the reduction in crime. Quite the opposite. And since these restrictions, gun crime has actually soared, out of control, regardless. Criminals will obtain guns regardless of the law. And it's not as though farmers have been irresponsible historically with their guns. The current discussion surrounding further restricting shotgun ownership is further evidence to the thought that the farmer represents kind of an uncontrolled power to the in the populace, and access to guns, is an equaliser. It's something that the government wished to be removed at worst, and heavily controlled at best. We have to ask ourselves, from the perspective of governments trying to enact a land grab at the moment, is it in their interest to make sure that the current landowner isn't armed? We've got to ask this question.
Sandy, I would add, the question is, are they worried if they turn up to slaughter your chickens or your cattle if under the circumstances, if you're armed? And that maybe takes us very neatly onto bird flu.
It does, unfortunately so, yes.